Turn to 2 Kings chapter 9, where we are continuing what is overall the study of the life and times of Elijah and Elisha, and we are getting toward the end of this study, and a certain fellow has now appeared on the scene named Jehu, who we have talked about the last couple weeks, and we will probably continue to talk about today and probably at least into next week. He is a very significant force at this point, if you will. We've gone through the first part of 2 Kings chapter 9, but we are by no means done with it, where we have seen that Elisha sent a man of the company of prophets to go and anoint Jehu as king over Israel. Now the thing is, it was not that Israel did not have a king at the time. Joram, the son of Ahab, was king during this time, but he had been wounded in battle. He had gone back to Jezreel. King Ahaziah of Judah had gone to visit him, and Jehu and his men were still on the front lines fighting against the Arameans, and this is when this anointing takes place. He's anointed king of Israel, and Jehu basically gets his men together and they go to Jezreel. And we read about last week how Jehu goes, and the lookout for Jezreel sees this force coming. And the king Joram, even though he's wounded, he's given commands. He says, send out a rider, send out a horseman, see what's going on. Do they come in peace? What's the deal here? These guys are supposed to be still at war with the Arameans. Why are they coming to Jezreel? But the horsemen, when they show up and say, hey, what's going on? Do you come in peace? He says, what do I have to do with peace? Fall in behind me. Come and join me. I kind of related this to the story about Napoleon Bonaparte when he escapes the island of Elba and goes back to France. It's sort of a very similar situation seems to be going on. This happens a couple times, and then, it's frustrating for Joram. He wants to know what's going on. He gets in his chariot himself, but the lookout at this point has figured out, well, the way this guy is riding, it looks like Jehu, son of Nimshi. I don't know how he knows that. Like, that is some good eyes and good knowledge about how a certain man rides his chariot, but he's able to identify him before he goes out. Both Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah of Judah both go out to meet him. And when they finally meet up with him, they just so happen to be on the land of Naboth, who had been killed by Ahab and Jezebel. It's not at all a coincidence that this happens. And very quickly, it turns to hostilities. That's Jehu's plan all along. His plan here is to destroy the house of Ahab. That was his instruction by the man of the prophets, was to destroy the house of Ahab. And he starts by killing King Joram, which is fully in line with that directive. And he just happens to kill him and discard his body in the land of Naboth's vineyard, which is something that was foretold. He talks about that. He also kills Ahaziah, king of Judah, since Ahaziah is there. We're going to get into that a little bit more and how that affects things in Judah later on. But just know he's killed both kings. That's a major point. So there's a major power vacuum. There's no king in Israel officially. I mean, Jehu is technically going to take that role. He's been anointed. And there's no king in Judah. And that's going to be a big deal later on. We're going to read about that a couple chapters later. So this is what has happened thus far. And that's about as far as we got up to the end of verse 29. One of the things I want to mention before we get into the next part is talking about Jehu himself. He seems, as we go through it, that he's following his instructions from the prophet perfectly. Destroy the house of Ahab. He's already got King Joram. That's kind of the main target. And he's going to go and he's going to continue to do that. He will destroy the house of Ahab. But he is not a perfect man. By the time we get to the end of chapter 10, we're going to see his shortfalls. We're going to talk about those. But I bring that up because God is not bringing this man up because he's the most righteous man, or he's found favor in the eyes of God for some reason. He is an instrument of God's judgment here. And I think we need to kind of recognize him as that tool of judgment from God. If you remember back to 1 Kings chapter 19, we have sort of a trifecta of what God tells Elijah to do regarding the next generation. Anoint Jehu as king of Israel, anoint Hazael, king over Aram, and anoint Elisha as prophet to succeed you. And now all those three men are in place. Hazael is now king in Aram. he's fighting Israel and Judah right now, but he is also a tool of judgment against Israel because of their wickedness. Elisha, actually, when he anoints Hazael as king over Aram, he weeps. You remember reading about this. He weeps because he knows all the terrible things he's going to do against the Israelites. But this is God's judgment upon them because they were unfaithful to him. So these are not, I would say maybe with the exception of Elisha, these three men are not righteous men. They are not holy men who do right all the time. These men are tools of judgment against the Israelites. And God says that even to Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19, where he says, basically those who get away from one of them, the other one's going to get them. He is going to make this judgment complete in this way. And a lot of that has to do with the house of Ahab, specifically with Jehu, but it's going to be for all of Israel. All of Israel abandoned God pretty much straight away as soon as it divided from Judah. When the divided kingdom happened, pretty much the first thing Jeroboam did is make a couple of golden calves and say, here are your gods, which sounds like a very familiar story that they should know better about, but that's how it works out. So this is God's judgment. We need to recognize that Jehu is not a good guy. I would not label him that way. He is a tool of judgment. So just keep that in mind as we're reading through. I don't want us to kind of get on this path of like, Jehu is an example that we should all follow. In some ways, maybe, but in other ways, maybe not so much. So we just need to kind of keep that in mind as we read through. Any comments on anything I've said up to verse 29? We're going to start in verse 30 in just a second. Okay, all right. I think I got us back up to speed on the recap. Someone read for us 2 Kings chapter 9, verses 30 through 37, please. Okay. So we're kind of continuing on what I would call Jehu's warpath here. So he's already finished off these two kings, Joram and Ahaziah, and he seems to have entered Jezreel at this point. And who happens to be there but Jezebel? Now, who is Jezebel? We haven't talked about her really in much detail in a while. Who is Jezebel? Ahab's wife. So at this point in time, she would be the mother of Joram. So she'd be the queen mother, the dowager, whatever title you want to assign to her, which we may think like, she's queen of a king, the wife of a king who has already passed on. She's not really an important figure, but she would be. I mean, we don't really think about this as much, but the mother of the king is still a very important position, would be an advisor, maybe even like a protector of the throne in a way, especially since Joram is now dead and there is no other successor named at this point. She would be the protector of the throne by kind of default. So she would be next in line until they would get one of his sons on the throne or one of his brothers, something like that. So don't think that, she's some retired person just sitting in, enjoying retirement, not being involved in the politics of the day, because I imagine she very much was. I don't really have any doubts about that. So this is not an unimportant character, and we'll also kind of talk about God's judgment and how that plays in here. But what does she do? She obviously has heard about Jehu entering Jezreel. What is her response? What does she decide that here's my idea that I've got? What's her grand plan here? Yeah, something. She's not trying to get away. She's not trying to like order fortifications or anything. She's getting her hair and makeup done, which, that sounds almost cliche. It's like, oh, yeah, that's the thing a woman would do. Somebody would say something like that. I think this is a Jezebel thing. I don't think this is a woman thing. That sounds like a ridiculous thing to do. But she's trying to make herself look impressive. Now, if this is to maybe seduce Jehu or trick him into thinking that, this beautiful woman, I shouldn't do anything bad to her. I don't really know why this is the way she goes. We can just kind of think about maybe what she's trying to do. Whatever it is, it doesn't work. We'll just go with that. Also, it kind of reminds me a little bit of 1 Timothy chapter 2. Maybe some of you are thinking of this too. Verses 9 and 10, where Paul writes to Timothy, I also want women to dress modesty with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elegant hairstyles or elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. Jezebel is the epitome of the opposite of that right now. She's wicked. We've talked about the terrible things she has done. She's pretty much, and we can't say this is for sure, but she's probably the one who made Baal worship what it was in Samaria, in Israel, because it just so happens when she marries Ahab, suddenly Ahab builds a temple to Baal in Samaria. That can't be a coincidence. She is Sidonian. She came from that area of the world where Baal was big as far as worship. So she seems to be kind of the root cause of a lot of the problems of idol worship in Israel at this time. She's the very opposite of the description in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. So she's not a godly woman. She's trying to make herself look very nice. Again, it doesn't work. Jehu, he has a plan to get her taken care of. Who does he get to help him out with Jezebel? Yeah, there's some eunuchs over there, and they're probably, attendants to her. That's why they're eunuchs, so they wouldn't do anything with her. That's something that we see in other places in the Bible. So this would not be an uncommon thing to do. And he tells them to do what? If you're on my side, do what? Throw her down. So I imagine she's up at least a couple stories. That's kind of the picture I get. We're not told exactly how high up she is, but it's enough that when they throw her down, it's going to do some damage, or at least make her immobilized for a time. And do they do it? Yeah, so I get the feeling they probably don't like Jezebel either. And this is this interesting thing that we see all these men just like that join Jehu. They have no problems. His men on the front line who are with him fighting this battle when Joram has gone back to Jezreel, they have no problem joining Jehu as soon as he tells them that he's been anointed king of Israel, even though they don't really seem to have any high regard for the prophet that came to anoint him. But as soon as they hear he's king of Israel, oh, yeah, we're behind you all the way. Yeah, we'll go with you to Jezreel. Yeah, we'll attack Jezreel. Yeah, we will kill the current king, Joram, to put you in place. You have the horsemen that are sent out to Jehu to go and talk with him. He says, fall in line behind me. They do, just like that. They have no problem doing that. These eunuchs now who are up there with Jezebel, they have no problem throwing her down. Again, is it so much that Jehu is just really popular, or is it just that Ahab's family was so unpopular? It might be some of both, but I certainly think this is probably more on Jezebel not being well-liked, because they have no problem throwing her down. Just immediately they do it. And we see some pretty gruesome language kind of talking about what happens to her. They throw her down. Her blood splatters on the wall. The horses, I imagine this is the horse of Jehu and his men, trample upon her. And then when they go to actually bury her, after all is said and done, what's left of her? Yeah, not much. Her skull, her hands, and her feet, that's it. And the only reason I think those are left is because there's probably not a lot of meat on those. If you go back to the description of what was going to happen to her in 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 23, this is after, Jezebel had plotted to kill Naboth, and Ahab had taken the land. And Elijah meets Ahab in Naboth's vineyard, and he tells him, your house is going to be destroyed. And then he has a very specific thing just for Jezebel. He says, this is what's going to happen to Jezebel. This is, again, 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 23. He says, also concerning Jezebel, the Lord says, dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. So they're in Jezreel. We got the description that her blood splattered on the wall. We know that's where that is. And now they can't find hardly any of her body left. The dogs have probably taken it at this point. Now, we don't get that description here in 2 Kings chapter 9, but from what we're told in 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 23, I imagine that's why they can't find anything. The dogs have gone in, they've taken everything they can, and there's only these few scraps that are left. There's nothing really recognizable about her. It's gone. And Jehu seems to recognize this as God's judgment. He even speaks about this. They speak about it in verse 36. This is the word of the Lord that he spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite. Again, kind of referencing 1 Kings chapter 21. On the plot of ground at Jezreel's dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh. And I don't see the dogs actually doing it, but they seem to recognize this is what's happened. And so there's nothing really left. There's nothing to go to or memorialize or really much to bury. She's just kind of gone. And that would be considered a great insult and a great, embarrassment for someone to not be buried properly in this time. Someone whose body is left out and never buried properly is considered a great humiliation. So that's become, Jezebel gets her own special judgment, and we've now seen here at the end of chapter 9, it has come true just as God said it would. I think that's about all I have on that. Any comments, anything on this last part of chapter 9 here? Go ahead, Arnold.
She was always, I guess, in opposition to what the Lord had wanted to be done. So this is, I guess, her payback.
Yeah, and we Jezebel and Ahab are quite a pair, aren't they? And we've talked about descriptions of Ahab, how it talks about he was the most wicked king, he was the worst king ever in Israel in its history. Even describing his sons, it says they were bad, but they weren't quite as bad as Ahab, which is just really bad on Ahab. And, absolutely, he was the wickedest of all kings, I guess. Is wickedest a word? Anyway, but I'm sure Jezebel had a lot to do with that. She was a Sidonian, she was a foreigner. God had warned them not to marry foreigners because of the problem with idolatry, and that's exactly what she brought. And not only did she bring idolatry, but she was active in pursuing and destroying the prophets of God. This is one of the reasons why when she threatens Elijah, that's why he flees. He's like, now Jezebel wants to kill me. I better get out of here. Forget Ahab. I'm afraid of Jezebel. She's the real problem. So God does not miss sight of that. He knows what she has done. She was really the mastermind when it came to taking Naboth's vineyard. Ahab just kind of went along with it. He shouldn't have, but she was kind of the driving force behind that. She's terrible. She's the worst. But God has not let her go down to the grave in peace, as they would say in those days. She got her comeuppance, if you will. Any other comments up to the end of this chapter? Go ahead, Jeff.
Part of me wonders why God didn't destroy Jezebel before he did. I think one of the reasons why might be that he wants us to see the end of that her values. And if he destroyed her sooner, we may not get that lesson. Certainly Naboth will be alive, but God took care of Naboth. We don't have to worry about the death of the righteous. He's giving her obviously chances to return, but as much as that, I think he's letting us see if this is the kind of life you live, this is the kind of person you're going to be, and it may be the same end that similar end that you experience, maybe not, but do you want to be that person that she has become?
Yeah, of all things.
Yeah, the idea is that was her dignity, that was her worth and her looks. And, of course, the passage you mentioned in 1 Timothy 2, the worth of a godly woman is that inner spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. 1 Peter 3 talks about that too.
Yeah, and definitely she did not have that. So yeah, she is the complete opposite of that. And kind of to maybe answer a little bit, why does God do this at this time? Now we can't always know for sure, but I would say a lot of it probably has to do with Ahab himself. We know that God gave Ahab a lot of opportunities. We won't go through the whole list. You all know we've gone through them. But when we get to the end of 1 Kings chapter 21, where Elijah is there in front of Ahab, and he is telling him, this is the judgment of God upon you because of this, last straw, if you will. Your whole household's going to be destroyed, Jezebel especially. All these things are going to happen. But in verse 27 of that chapter, it says, when Ahab heard these words, he tore his clothes, he put on sackcloth, and he fasted. He lay in sackcloth and went around meekly. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite. Have you noticed how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he had humbled himself, I will not bring this disaster in his day, but I will bring it on his house in the days of his son. So I would say the only reason Jezebel is alive at this point is because he was going to let Ahab die first, so Ahab would not see this destruction. This was maybe God's last mercy for Ahab in this way. So all of this destruction is now coming on during Joram's time instead of Ahab's time. In my mind, that's the only reason she would still be around, is to kind of pay that one last mercy to Ahab, which we would kind of think about, like, is that really, because Ahab dies in a very gruesome and terrible way in the battlefield. It's not like it's a great way to go, but God is recognized that this one time Ahab actually humbled himself. So he's giving him this one last mercy. That's maybe the only answer I've got for that. We can't really exactly know everything in the mind of God, but that would be a reason that I think we could have evidence for. Any other comments on chapter 9? Go ahead, Bethany. Oh, I didn't mention that. Thank you. So why does he call him Zimri? I skipped that part in my notes because this is obviously not Zimri. This is Jehu. Does anybody remember who Zimri is? Why he would be significant? Okay, turn back to 1 Kings chapter 16 real quick. This is actually before Elijah comes on the scene. We see Elijah for the first time in chapter 17. In 1 Kings chapter 16, we had Baasha. He overthrew the king of Israel at that time. And then his son came in. And then Zimri comes in at verse 15 of chapter 16. And he overthrows the king, and he only reigns for 7 days, and then Omri overthrows him. Now, Omri would be the father of Ahab, father-in-law to Jezebel, all that. So I think she's bringing up this kind of history that, oh, you're like Zimri. You have betrayed your master. You betrayed your king. You should feel ashamed of yourself, which would be something that Jehu would definitely know of. I don't know if he probably wasn't quite alive at this time. This was a little bit before his generation, but he would definitely know this history. And it's just interesting because Omri, who would have been the father to Ahab, was the one that took out Zimri. There's a little bit of a direct connection there. But yeah, I think that's why she calls him that, because not that she's confused about who this is, but to bring up, oh, you're just like this traitor. You're no good. You're nothing. Really looking down on her. Of course, this happens right before the eunuchs just decide to throw her down, and well, that's the end of her. But yeah, I think that's why she calls him that. Do you have a follow-up on that?
Well, yeah, just Omri was a commander that then killed the king, but so did Omri, but she doesn't, I think the reason she brings up Zimri and not Omri was Ahab's father, so it's in her, I guess in her relatives.
Yeah.
Also, Zimri kills not only just Beulah, but all of Baasha's descendants, he killed the whole line.
Yeah, that was.
What he's doing, what Jehu's doing, is killing the whole line. So I think that's why he doesn't just kill the person in charge; he's also killing all the family.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels there, and Baasha had done that for the king before him. This happened several times in Israel's northern kingdom, where the entire family gets wiped out and a new family takes dominance over the kingdom. That doesn't happen quite the same way in Judah. For the most part, it's all one line. There's a little hiccups here, but then it comes back. But for the most part, when you go through it, except for really short times, it's always a descendant of David on the throne. We're going to get to one of those just temporary exceptions later on in the study. But now over and over again, we're seeing just total overthrow of royal families. So there is this interesting parallel here, and there's a lot of interesting parallels, kind of strengthen that connection. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I've neglected to mention that. But yeah, no, that's a great detail, and obviously a purposeful one. This is not her accidentally calling him by the wrong name. She is definitely invoking this history to kind of put shame on him. Very good. Any other comments, questions, thoughts? Okay. So that's the end of Jezebel. Now we're not quite to the end of Ahab's family yet. Jehu's going to keep going. Someone read for us 2 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 through 5, please. 1 through 5.
Now Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria, and Jehu wrote and sent letters to Samaria, to the rulers of Jezreel, to the elders, and to those who reared Ahab's sons, saying, Now as soon as this letter comes to you, since your master's sons are with you, and you have chariots and horses, a fortified city also, and weapons, choose the best qualified of your master's son, set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house. But they were exceedingly afraid and said, Look, 2 kings could not stand up to him. How then can we stand?
Through 5, please.
Oh. And he who was in charge of the house, and he who was in charge of the city, the elders also, and those who reared the sons, sent to Jehu, saying, We are your servants. We will do all you tell us, but we will not make anyone king. Do what is good in your sight.
Okay, so Joram, Jezebel, they're dead. So Jehu moves to, I would call, like phase 2 of his plan here. And this is, his plan here is to destroy the house of Ahab. That is his end goal right now. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, verse 1 tells us that there are 70 sons of Ahab in Samaria. Now, I think when we see the term sons, I think that is probably better understood as descendants, because this may have included grandkids, things like that, because it talks about some of these administrators who tended to them and were caretakers for them. Now, it could, be like, your butlers and all that stuff who would just normally be attendants, but it may be more than that. It may be like, the nurse and the ones who oversee their upbringing and their education. I think we're talking about a pretty big span as far as the generation here. So I don't think it's necessarily direct sons of Ahab. It may be descendants like grandkids, things like that. And so Jehu sends a message to these administrators, the guardians of Ahab's descendants, to choose the best of them, anoint him as king, then fight for him. You have all these materials, all these things that you could fight with. Basically, Jehu is kind of daring them to challenge him. Is kind of what we see here. Is, hey, you've still got these chariots, you've still got these cities. Anoint a king, fight for him. Try to fight back. But they have obviously heard what has happened. They said, well, he's already killed 2 kings. How are we going to stand up to this guy? They don't think that they're up for it. Remember, both Joram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah have been killed by him, and pretty much all in one go. So they say they're not going to anoint. They're not going to accept the challenge. They're just going to say, we're not going to anoint anyone else. You just do what you think is best. We'll just listen to you. So that's as far as they are resisting, which is not really at all. That's kind of the point here. And we're going to see how kind of this plays out in the next section. Any comments on this setup, though, for Jehu's next phase? All right, let's read the next part, and we'll kind of see how this works out. So I'm going to read 2 Kings 10, verses 6 through 11, please.
Then he wrote a second letter to them, saying, If you are for me and will obey my voice, take the heads of the men, your master's sons, and come to me at Jezreel by this time tomorrow. Now the king's sons, 70 persons, were with great men of the city who were rearing them. So it was, when the letter came to them, they took the king's sons and slaughtered 70 persons, put their heads in sent them to him in Jezreel. Then a messenger came and told him, saying, they have brought the heads of the king's sons. He said, lay them in 2 heaps at the entrance of the gate until morning. So it was in the morning that he went out and stood and said to all the people, you are righteous. Indeed, I conspired against my master and killed him. But who killed all these? Know now that nothing shall fail to the earth, fall to the earth of the word of God which the Lord spoke concerning the house of Ahab. For the Lord had done what he spoke by his servant Elijah. So Jehu killed all who remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, and all his great men and his close acquaintances and his priests, until he left him none remaining.
Okay. So we need to talk about geography just a second. Where is Jehu? What city is he in? He's in Jezreel, and he's sending these messengers to what city?
Well, the rulers of Jezreel.
So he's looking to get those sons of Ahab that are in Samaria, right? So there's a little bit. We're in 2 different cities here, which is why he's sending messengers. He's not going himself. He's sending these messages. So his second message now is basically telling these administrators, you call them bureaucrats, that might not even be a bad term, basically saying, now prove your loyalty to me, and here's how you can prove your loyalty to me. Since they're not going to fight him, they're not going to resist him, they'll do whatever he says. So he tells them, what you need to do is you need to kill all these sons of Ahab and send them my way. Let me get some proof of that. And you got 24 hours to comply. So he's getting this done in very rapid order. This would be a very quick thing to do. The city's not extremely far apart, but you would not have time to delay to get this order done within that amount of time. You couldn't get the message and say, we'll plan out something, along, somewhere down the line. We'll take care of it. No, you're going to have to take care of it right away so that you get those heads back up to Jezreel the next day. So they do it. They follow what he says, and we see in verse 8, he's told that they've brought the heads of the princes. That's referring to those who are descendants of the house of Ahab, and they put them in piles at the entrance to the gate. Now, why would they do that? What would be the point of putting these heads at the gate of the city? Yeah, everyone's coming through. They're going to see it. He wants them to see that. This is kind of a sign that there's new management in charge now. The house of Ahab is gone, essentially. He's showing house of Ahab's gone. Jehu is kind of solidifying his position as king here, basically showing everyone that I have the power to do what I want, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to take care of anyone who could potentially challenge me. This is kind of a threat in a way to all the people, to kind of remind them, like, this is what will happen if you get in my way. So it's a very public thing. And then in verse 9, we see that Jehu, he goes and he stands before the people. He addresses the people now. Then he says, you're all innocent. None of you were a part of this. This is me. I conspired to do this. But he also kind of gives credit to God here. In verse 10, he says, basically, the word of the Lord that was spoken concerning Ahab's house is coming true. God's judgment is coming true. So he is invoking God here, and rightly so. God said this. We've already talked about 1 Kings chapter 21. In Naboth's vineyard, Elijah told Ahab this was going to happen. And now we see that this is coming to fruition. And apparently Jehu must have been there, because he kind of talks about earlier in chapter 9 how he recalled to another, hey, remember when we were with Ahab in the vineyard and Elijah said this thing? So he may have even been there, which is not something we knew back then, but he brings it up in chapter 9. So Jehu is well aware of the judgment that God was going to bring upon Ahab's family. So Jehu has gone ahead, and he's been the tool of that judgment. And then in verse 11 here, we see that he wipes out everyone who remained in the house of Ahab. And it's not just talking about blood relatives here. It talks about his chief men, his close friends, his priests even, all these people that have associations even with the house of Ahab in Jezreel are put to death. None of them are surviving. None of them would, basically anyone who might have a reason to challenge Jehu to fight for the house of Ahab, they're all eliminated, even if they're not a blood relative. And we'll see kind of more of that later in this chapter. But Jehu is being very complete here. There is no, oh, so-and-so won't be a problem. We'll just leave them alone. He's doing it completely. You think Saul would want to take notes on this. But so, he's doing what he's supposed to be doing here. He's wiping out the house of Ahab. Any comments, thoughts through verse 11? Okay. We can probably do one more section then real quickly. Someone read for us verses 12 through 17, please. 12 through 17.
And he arose and departed, and came to Samaria. And as he was at the shearing house in the way, Jehu met with the brethren of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and said, Who are ye? And they answered, We are the brethren of Ahaziah, and we go down to salute the children of the king, the children of the queen. And he said, Take them alive. And they took them alive, and slew them at the pit of the shearing house, even to the 40 men, neither left he any of them. And when he was departed thence, he lighted on Jehoshaphat, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him. And he saluted him and said to him, Is thy heart right? As my heart is with thy heart. And Jehoshaphat answered, It is. If it be, give me thine hand. And he gave him his hand. And he took him up to him in the chest. And he said, Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. So they made him ride in his chariot. And when he came to Samaria, he slew all that remained unto Ahab in Samaria, till he had destroyed him, according to the saying of the Lord, which he spake to Elijah.
Okay. So we see, at the end of verse 11, Jehu has secured Jezreel. I don't think liberated is the right word. He is definitely taking care of things in Jezreel. And now he's heading towards Samaria. Remember, Samaria is actually the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. It just seems the house of Ahab had a lot of, they had a house and a lot of stuff going on in Jezreel. So they were often there. But the actual capital was in Samaria. Joram, Jezebel, they're dead. Jehu moves now to go down to, and everyone else in Jezreel. So he moves from Jezreel to go down to Samaria. And he meets some relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah. Now, I get from this conversation that they have that these guys don't know what's really happened yet. Apparently, they had not stopped along the way or had heard what was going on, because when he asks them who they are, they say, oh, yeah, we're relatives of Ahaziah, and we're going to greet the king and the queen mother. I think they're talking about Joram and Jezebel, who are dead now. They have obviously not heard what has happened. Otherwise, they would not say this. In fact, they would probably not be going this way. If they knew they were dead, they'd probably be going back to Judah. So he takes them, it says in 14, his instruction is to take them alive, but immediately after, they slaughter them. So all these 42 men that were relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah, who's also dead at this point, now they are killed off. So anyone who even is coming to say greetings to the house of Ahab, he's taking them out too, even if they're not related. Again, those who are just associated in any way with Ahab's house are being killed by Jehu. He's being very, very thorough about it. And then we get to verse 15. We have a very interesting interaction between Jehu and this man named Jehonadab, son of Rechab. And we don't really know much about this Jehonadab guy. He just kind of appears here, and that's it. Except for if you turn to Jeremiah 35, there's this interesting interaction that Jeremiah has regarding these Rechabites, so perhaps the descendants of Rechab, which Jehonadab is a son of, and talks about, but I'm not going to go through the entire chapter because it's a little bit lengthy, but if you want to look through it, there's this interesting interaction between these descendants of, they talk about their forefather Jehonadab, son of Rechab, who gave them a command to never drink wine. And so God gives them, this mercy. They were good. They were not drinking wine. They were keeping themselves pure in that way. So he granted them some mercy that there would always be basically a descendant of that family that would continue on even in captivity of of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. I'm assuming this is the same guy we see here that they're talking about in Jeremiah 35, as we see here in 2 Kings chapter 10. This Jehonadab, because it happens that his forefather is the same. It's Rechab. It's also the same name. Now, there is a Rechab that also appears during the time of Saul. I'm not sure if that's the same guy, but it seems that Jeremiah 35 is talking about this same Jehonadab here in 2 Kings chapter 10. That's my guess. It's, as far as I can tell, they're referring to that guy. So I imagine that this Jehonadab is a guy of some righteousness. He seems, judging what we see in Jeremiah 35, that he sees problems with getting drunk and all these things. So that's why he gives this command to his descendants. And we don't know exactly how Jehonadab and Jehu know each other, but he seems to recognize him. He says, "Are you with me?" And he says, "Yes, I am." And he says, I love Jehu's command to him, come up with me in my chair and see my zeal for the Lord, which is a really interesting statement. And I want you guys to remember this because we won't get through the rest of this chapter today. We're going to have to stop here. But remember what Jehu says here in verse 16. Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord, because I'm going to challenge that statement a little bit later. So, are we saying, is he just saying stuff to get support, or does he actually believe in, following God and keeping his commandments? We're going to talk more about that later in this chapter, but remember that phrase, because I think that's a really interesting statement that he makes. But they both go together, and Jehu, at the very end here, at chapter 17 that we read, Jehu comes to Samaria, and what does he do? Kills all the house of Ahab. Again, he's being very complete. He started in Jezreel, took out everyone there. He's taken out everyone associated, even who wants to just greet the king of the family of Ahab. He goes down to Samaria. He wipes them out there. And we're going to see a little bit more of what he's going to do later on in this chapter, but we're out of time. So we're going to stop there at verse 17. Again, Jehu doing everything he can to wipe out the house of Ahab. So far, so good. But, just time is something that we can't get around. So we'll stop there. We'll pick up in verse 18 next week. We'll probably finish chapter 10, and we may even start chapter 11, depending on how much we have to talk about. There's some really interesting things about Jehu that we will talk about toward the end of chapter 10 as to how much zeal he really has for the Lord. We'll kind of talk about that, which is why I think that statement's really interesting. So we'll talk about that next week. So if you haven't already read chapter 11, you might want to start reading that, because we may start that next week as well. But we'll stop there unless there are any final comments, questions. I'm not going any further. All right, very good. We'll stop there, and we'll pick up verse 18 next week. Thank you.